Hello everyone and welcome to this video. In this video we're going to be exploring Armitage. Alright, so we're actually going to be performing exploits on our vulnerable operating system, which in this case is Metasploitable 2. So I hope you're really excited. So you might be asking yourself, what exactly is Armitage? Well, Armitage is simply the graphical user interface for Metasploit. Alright, so the way you have Nmap and Zenmap, Nmap being the command line interface, and you have your Zenmap, which is the graphical user interface, that is the same way. So you have your Metasploit console and Armitage. So Armitage is the graphical user interface for Metasploit, alright? So some of the advantages are it gives the user much better idea of what's going on. So great ease of access, and the user is able to understand the scan process and how everything is being exploited. And it just gives the user graphical representation of the scan and the exploitation technique. Alright, so let's get started. Now by default, Armitage can be found on the dock on Kali Linux. So if you just go to the little green haired creature icon, I'm not sure if that is what it is, but regardless of that, as you can see, it is Armitage. Or if you do not have it on your dock, you can just go into applications and you can go into exploitation tools and you'll find Armitage there. Alright, so just click on Armitage and now it's going to prompt you to connect to the local host. In a few seconds, just give it a few seconds to start up. And there we are. It's going to prompt you to connect to the local host and the port. Just hit connect. Do not change anything here. And once you hit connect, it's going to prompt you to start the Metasploit RPC server. So just hit yes, we want to do that. And now it's going to start connecting to the remote host, and just give it a few seconds and we should be good with Armitage. Alright, so the great thing about Armitage, as I said, is that the exploitation the exploitation process is automated, as well as the setting of hosts, the setting of targets, but vulnerability analysis. It also offers functionality like that, and we'll be looking at this when we'll be exploiting our Metasploitable 2 virtual machine. Alright, so as you can see, Armitage is loaded up, and you might be a bit confused with the interface because you heard me tell you that it was a graphical user interface and now you're seeing a Metasploit console here. Well, don't worry about that. The Metasploit console there is there to aid you in what exactly is going on. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to start with is I'm going to start with this little toolbar up here. This little toolbar is very simply put. So in Armitage, you can change settings like add a new connection. You can check the preferences. You can set the target view settings. You can set the target view, set the exploit rank. You can use a SOX proxy like we did in the proxy chains video. We can look at the listeners, so you can connect to or wait for. You can set the L host, the listening host, if you want another listening host. For example, if you're running Kali Linux on another computer, and you want that computer to also listen to. You also have your scripts, and you can close Armitage. In terms of the view, this is just to edit the view. When we look at hosts, you can add your host. So for example, we'll add our Metasploitable 2 virtual machine here, but we'll do that in a few seconds. We have Nmap scans, which is awesome. You can automate Nmap scans directly from Armitage. You then have your Metasploit scans, which is awesome. We then have your DNS enumeration, which we looked at in the information gathering section. I hope you remember. So everything can come together really beautifully, and that's why I really enjoy using Armitage, and I'm sure you'll see why. Alright, you can then clear your database, which is essentially just clearing any of the leftover scans that you had performed or exploits that you had performed. You then have your attacks, where you can find attacks on your target or your host, and you have Hail Mary, which is something we'll look at in a few minutes. Okay, looking at the workspaces, you can manage and show all the workspaces you currently have. In terms of help, you have your homepage, your tutorials, scripts, and your about section. Alright, fantastic. Now let's get into the interface. So the interface is sorted into 3 sections. Alright, you have your first section, your second section, and your third section. Alright, so you can enlarge them and resize them depending on how you want them to be displayed. So I usually like having mine like this because I like having to see what the console displays. But as much as I like that, we'll be looking at the first section here. In the first section, essentially what is being displayed here is your pre-configured modules. Alright, so you can also search for modules here, in this little search bar. So this is where you have all the modules sorted in terms of auxiliary, exploits, payloads, and the post, which we'll look at in a few seconds. When it comes to the second interface here, The second interface is used to display your active targets that we were able to exploit against. Alright, so this is where all your active targets will be displayed in forms of computers. We'll look at that again when we'll get started with Metasploitable 2. As for the console, this is your Metasploit console, and it'll be, well, your activity will be sorted in forms of tabs here. Again, you look at exactly how that happens, and essentially allows you to run your Metapredator or your console sessions simultaneously. Something really, really awesome, and I'm sure you'll appreciate it. Okay, let's get started with your module section. So, as I said, your modules essentially contain all your modules in this section, and they're sorted in terms of auxiliary, exploits, payloads, and post, and you can go through them. So for example, we have auxiliary. You can look at the auxiliary scanners. You have your scanners, fuzzers, your sniffers, spoofers, etc., etc. You have your exploits, where your exploits are sorted in terms of their platform that they're running on and operating system that they're running on. For example, you have Android, Apple, iOS, Firefox, FreeBSD, Linux, Unix, Mac OS X, and Windows. You then have your payloads that are also sorted in terms of their platforms and their operating systems that they are to be exploited on. Alright, you then have your post, which is also similarly sorted in terms of their platforms and the operating systems that they are designed to be exploited on. So let me just close every one of these, and as I said, you can also use the search bar here to search for the Metasploit modules. Alright, now let's get started with some actual exploitation, and we're going to start off with Metasploitable 2. Alright, so what we're going to do is we're going to go into hosts. Alright, now in hosts, you can import hosts or you can add hosts. We're not going to add a host yet, and the reason is I'm going to use an Nmap scan to also perform some information gathering while adding the host. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into Nmap scan, and I want to perform a quick scan that will detect the operating system that is running on our target or our host for that matter. So I'm going to click on that, and now it's going to prompt you to enter your host IP address or your target IP address or the range if you want to scan your entire network. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get the IP address for Metasploitable 2, which as you can see here is 192.168.1.106. So we're just going to enter that right now. Excellent. So once we hit enter, it's going to perform the Nmap scan and it's going to detect what operating system is running. Now, as I said here, the activities are going to be sorted out in terms of tabs. So your console is still open and your Nmap scan is still ongoing here, or it's just started, and you can run them both simultaneously, which is fantastic, right? So the scan is done and it should give you a prompt here saying the scan is complete. Voila. So it's going to give you an option here saying use attacks, find attacks to suggest applicable exploits for your targets. Interesting. So I'm going to hit OK. And what do we have here? Well, we have a little cute little penguin here to represent Linux. So we know it is running Linux 2.6 and the kernel is not specified more than that. Alright, so you can see the services and the ports and the services running on these ports with the Nmap scan. So we were able to get information about our target. And now we understand what operating system is running on it, and we can see the services running on the ports. In the previous video, we looked at exploiting the FTP protocol or the FTP port with the VSFTPD backdoor. And how did we do that? Alright, the first thing we did is we know that it exists as an exploit. So we're going to go into our modules and I'm going to show you exactly how to find it. So we're going to go into exploits. And we are going to go into Unix because it is a Unix exploit. And once I click into Unix, we're going to then select the protocol, which in this case is the FTP protocol right here. And we're going to expand that. And voila, you have your VSFTPD 2.3.4 backdoor. So if you want to execute this, what we do is we just double click it. Alright, and once we double click it, it's going to give you the options that we used in the previous or we used in the Metasploit console. Options like setting your R host and the R port. So by default, the L host, which is your listening host, which is your IP address, is set by default. So 192.168.1.107, and the default listening port is also set by default. All you have to do is just enter your R host, which in this case is 192.168.1.106, and we will exploit the backdoor using the FTP service. So 192.168.1.106. And once you're ready, you can just hit launch. All right, and it's going to launch the exploit. So just give it a few seconds and it's going to open up a new tab over here, the exploit tab. Just give it a few seconds here. And there we are, found shell, command shell opened, and voila, we have backdoor access. Now you might have noticed something also very, very interesting. the Linux computer here is now surrounded by lightning or electricity and is turned red. Now this means that we have successfully exploited this system in one way or another. Alright, so this is fantastic. Everything is automated really well. But now you might be asking, I want to exploit more things with Metasploitable. What can I do now? Alright, tell me what I can do. So what we're going to do is we're going to close up this menu here. And what the awesome thing here, as I said, is the automation. But before that, I'm just gonna, well, if I look at the shell that's running, if I right click, sorry about that, if I right click on the target, we can see that it gives us options to log into the default network services. Now that is something just, very common. Once you've cracked them, if the cracking process is possible, you can then log into things like the FTP protocol, the HTTP, MySQL, SSH, you get the idea. Now the shell that we created, which is what the exploit that we used, allows us to interact with it. We can then upload, we can pass the session, we can post modules, and we can disconnect. So let's say we wanted to interact with it. So if we wanted to interact with it, it's going to open up a shell for us. And again, we can list the files on the server, the Metasploitable 2, virtual machine, which is considered to be a server because it does run some web applications. And voila, you have access to the root folder. So let's see if we change directory to the home directory and we list the files in there. We have the MSF admin. So let's also change directory into that MSF admin. And we can list the files in there. We have the vulnerable, so cd vulnerable, and if we list there, we have the web services that are running. So you have MySQL, the Samba, TikiWiki, etc. So I'm just going to close the shell because we're done with that exploit. Let's look at how to exploit or how to find exploits automatically now. So I'm going to close that shell and I'm just going to right click and I'm going to go to the shell one and I'm going to disconnect because we're done with that exploit. Right, so once it's disconnected, it's going to remove the little icon that denoted the fact that the operating system or the computer was exploited. Now, you might be asking, well, how do we find exploits automatically? Well, we go into attacks and we find attacks. All right, so now it's going to find attacks that you can run on the operating system or the computer. In this case, our target host, which is the Metasploitable 2 virtual machine. So as you can see, it's going to query the exploits and just give it a few seconds to go through all of them. And once it's done, it's going to give you all a list of the compatible exploits that you can use or exploits that can actually exploit a vulnerability on the operating system or the target that you've chosen. So if we right click now and we go into attack, you can see that it's listed all the services that we can crack. So if we go to FTP, we have the VSFTPD backdoor here. We have the pure FTP bash execution here. You can also check for exploits again. You have your telnet, you have your HTTP vulnerabilities. So these are all vulnerability or exploits that you can run on this virtual machine. So if we go to, for example, something like the web app, or let's get something more practical. If we go into the MySQL, so we only have one exploit for the MySQL database. So if we click on this payload, if we load it and let's see if everything is set correctly, the rhost, there we are. That's okay. So we're just going to launch. Or let's see if we can get any information. Right. So it's going to start the exploit in a new tab. I'm just going to close the old tab. So it's going to start the exploit process. Just give it a few seconds here. And there we are. It's going through a process. For some reason, the MySQL function system execution is not available. So yeah, this exploit did not work. Now this is what I was talking about. Not every exploit is going to work. And it's really important that you understand this. Whether or not a computer is vulnerable to an attack, different exploits might not work for different reasons. So let's try and find another exploit that we can use here. So I'm just going to right click and we're going to go into attack. And let's see if we can look at the real server here or Samba. Let's try the trans2 open on the Samba server. All right. So make sure the settings are set by default here and I'm going to hit launch. Right, so I'm just going to close the old exploit, started bind handler. And again, the target is not vulnerable. The Samba server is running the Samba 3.0.20 Debian. So again, not vulnerable, but regardless of that, you can take your time and find services that are vulnerable. So let's see what else we can try and exploit. What about the SSH service? All right, so let's see if we can actually get SSH access. That will be really fantastic. So let's see what we can get here. So let's try and look at what services are running on the SSH port. So if we go to Nmap and I look at the SSH port, which is port 22, we have OpenSSH that's running on Ubuntu. So Debian Ubuntu. So let's go back to attacks and let's go to SSH. All right, and let's see whether we can get any vulnerabilities here. If I click on more, as you can see, you have Ubiquity and the other exploits that you can use. So I'm just going to use something random. So let's try the Tectisia password change request. Again, make sure your settings like your rhost are set correctly and just hit launch. Again, this might not work. All right, there we are. The authorization is continuing. Let's see if we can get anything. So far, the exploitation has not been successful. Again, as I said, not all services will be able to be exploited, even if they are vulnerable, right? And that is the real charm of exploitation, is finding the correct vector or the correct entry point. All right, so if I right click here, as you can see, that was a failure. So I'm just going to close the exploit again. We're going to close that one as well. And let's try and find one that works before we end this video. All right, so attack, web applications or VNC. We can actually look at VNC because I feel that we can get, there we are. So VNC keyboard execution. I'm going to hit OK. Let's see if we can get access to the VNC here. All right, there we are. For some reason, it hasn't started. All right, there it started. Opening run command, and yeah, by default the VNC the connection was reset by the peer. So the Metasploitable 2 virtual machine has some sort of protection against unknown logins through VNC. So we're going to try another attack vector here. Hopefully, as I said, we can get one. We're just going to try the X11 keyboard execution, and we're going to launch that. Again, another exploit here. Give that a few seconds. Or we can actually perform the normal Google search. So that is also an option that we can do. So as you can see, that exploit failed there. Now let's go back into Nmap and let's see what else we can exploit here. Let's look at another service that we can exploit here. For example, the Telnet. Let's try and connect to Telnet. So attack, we can look at Telnet and the Telnet encrypt key ID. I'm going to launch that and we're going to close that older exploit tab there. Let's try this one. Trying target. All right, so it's brute forcing the possible targets. Just give it its time. Exploit aborted due to failure. This system does not support encryption. Anyway, that was basically how to use Armitage, to perform automated exploits and how to perform normal, target host scans to gather information about your target, vulnerability analysis, and furthermore, automating the exploitation process. All right, so that's going to be it for this video. I'll be seeing you in the next video where we'll get started with Metasploit.